Good evening from Hong Kong, from the University of Hong Kong. I know some of you may be in America, so in that case, good morning. And then if you are in Europe, good afternoon. I'm Chen Zhiwu, professor of finance and economics at the University of Hong Kong. Since some of you are new to this quantitative history webinar series, just a little bit background. So we started this webinar series about 11 months ago. The main purpose is really to promote quantitative history research. But I have to say we're not exclusive. I mean, we don't exclude other approaches to history research. In fact, we always would like to emphasize the importance of qualitative history research, in particular, knowing the historical context and the environment, the social conditions, as well as natural conditions in which historical events took place. So I want to emphasize this in particular. Professor Hansen would like to say that she's not going to present a lot of numbers or do causality tests and so on. So I just want to pre-warn you that we're not hostile or if anything, we want to hear from great historians like Professor Valerie Hansen. So today, our webinar is, will take us back by at least 1,000 years. So my friend and former colleague at Yale, Valerie Hansen, graciously agreed to talk about her second major book. That is also the title of the webinar today, The Year 1000, When Explorers Connected the World and Globalization Began. So this is the book. So if you have not purchased this book, is a very good start. Or if you have not read this earlier book by Valerie, The Silk Road, A New History, you should check that out too. So 2 books covering almost everything you need to know or to get you started on research on the history of the Silk Road, both the overland Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road, which Valerie said earlier that this is going to be her 3rd book. So especially when I read the Silk Road book, I was very impressed with a few things, among which is the emphasis and reminder by Valerie again and again that don't think there is a big boulevard called the Silk Road where there are always a lot of cars or horses and people, going really long distance to trade goods. In fact, if anything, by far, most of the years, most of the days, you will not see anyone really walking, doing the long distance walking or trading trips. Anyway, so we're very pleased to have Professor Valerie Hansen. She is the, I forgot your new title. She is the Stanley Woodward Professor of History, because before I left Yale, she was at that time the chairman of the history department. And
no, never history department. Okay. I was the chair of East Asian Studies. Don't flatter me.
All right, so maybe I should just stop here, giving you the time so that okay, just very quickly, the format of today's webinar is just like before. So Professor Hansen will talk for up to 1 hour. And then after her talk, we invited Professor William Guangling Liu from Linnan University, also a historian, not only on the physical history of China, but also more particularly a historian on the Tang and Song Dynasty period Without further ado, Valerie, here you go.
Thank you very much, Zhiwu, for your overly generous introduction. I'm very happy that we were able to find a time that was good for me. I'm a morning person, and I'm assuming most of your audience are evening people, or your audience in Hong Kong and China are evening people. And today, the talk I'm going to give draws on my book about the year 1000, and I'm going to focus on ocean travel. I think I'm focusing on ocean travel because I think it's most people, when they think about the year 1000, if they think about the year 1000, don't really think about ocean travel. And I'm going to talk about the 3 cases where we know the most about ocean travel. So I'm going to start with the Vikings. Then I'm going to talk about the Malayo-Polynesians. And that's a mouthful, but it's basically the ancestors of people who today speak either languages related to the Malay languages, the Malayic languages, or Polynesian. And then I'll end with the Chinese. And just as we were talking before the Zoom began, Zhiwu was telling me about his idea about why the Chinese don't leave home so much. And maybe that's something we can talk about in the Q&A, because I disagree totally. I think that they do leave home. And look, Zhiwu, you left home too. So it's true, you've come back to Hong Kong. Let me start by sharing my screen. And I'll start with a map. So this is a map, just getting it here, that shows us the Viking voyages. And they start, this is from this is actually I was going to say, the voyages, they start, so this is the Viking homeland in Scandinavia, and they probably started in Denmark, and we know that they reached Iceland. This is quite a specific year in AD 871, because of this is based on volcanic layers, so it's quite a precise date. And it's matched. There's a museum in Reykjavik that you can go to that's called the AD 71 plus or minus house. And then from there, and this is, from Iceland to Greenland, I'm showing you the route taken by Eric the Red, and he was the father of a man named Leif Erikson. And we know about this, and this, I was going to say there are 2 groups of sources about the Viking voyages. One group is textual and written down, and it's called the Icelandic sagas, and they're written in Old Norse. And then the other group, the other information is archaeological. And you can see here that Eric the Red goes to Greenland, and then from Greenland, there are a number of people, including Leif Erikson, who set off from Greenland, and they travel and describe in these sagas traveling to a place they call the land of slabs, which most people think is stone slabs and means Baffin Island, and then a land of beaches, and this is of trees, this is Labrador, and then they get to a place called Vinland. And before there was archaeological excavations in the 1960s, people weren't sure where they had gone. There were different schools of thought. But the discovery of this site on the tip of the island of Newfoundland is really convinced people that the Vikings had made it to North America. And it also provided a date. There's carbon-14 dates showing that there were about 10 years of occupation at the site, from 1000 to about 1010. And you can see here, this is what the landscape looks like. What it looked like in 1999 is what it looks like now. It's a very beautiful place. There's a wonderful museum. When we can all travel again, I urge you to go there. And then what happened was that there was a Norwegian couple, the Ingstads, who were looking for evidence of Norse occupation in the Americas. And they sailed down the coast of the map I just showed you. They sailed down from Baffin Island and Labrador, and asking the local people if there were any possible Norse sites. And when they got to Lansall Meadows, the locals said to them that there were some collapsed dwellings built out of grass and peat. And unfortunately, I don't have any photographs to show you what they looked like in the 1960s. But I think we can just imagine a collapsed dwelling of grass. And the local people said that they thought that these had been lived in by the indigenous peoples of the area. So what the Canadians would call the First Nations. But there were 7 years of excavation, and the Ingstads found many things that convinced them that the site was not. There were later layers of First Nations settlement, but this artifact was the convincing, clinching artifact that persuaded everyone that this was indeed a Norse site. It's a bronze pin. It's about 10 centimeters long, and it was used to fasten a cloak at the neck. And it was probably dropped by one of the Norse who came to the site. And the metalworking, there was metalworking in the Americas, but no one was working bronze like this. And this pin matches pins that were found in both Denmark and Iceland between 950 and 1020. So the timing is perfect. So this was really incontrovertible evidence of the Viking presence in North America. The Vikings left or the Norse left after about 10 years at Lansall Meadows. Is actually funny, the Lansall Meadows is not shown on this map. But we know that they came back periodically. And I was going to say, we're not sure why they left. The sagas tell us that they had conflicts with the local people. They were outnumbered by them. They had an advantage that they had bronze daggers, and the local people did not have metal knives. And it's also possible that the Norse it wasn't profitable enough. They couldn't see a way to finance a colony. But after about 10 years, they leave, but they come back periodically because Greenland has no trees, and Iceland, once it was occupied by people after 871, also had no new trees. And the Norse needed trees to build houses. And we know that they came back. They described these voyages, but we also know they came back because of this find. It's a penny, and it was minted in Norway. And the date of this particular coin is sometime it was made during the reign of a king who ruled between 1065 and 1080. And it was found here on the Goddard site in the state of Maine. And so this is evidence that the Norse went farther south than Lansall Meadows. We also know from the Icelandic sagas that they describe traveling to warm places where they see wild wheat growing, and that description doesn't fit the climate of northern Newfoundland or even the Labrador. So we know that I would say most people think they came down the East Coast somewhere in Maine, maybe to Massachusetts. If you are ever walking along the Charles River in Boston, you can run into a plaque that tells you that the Norse landed there, and that plaque was put there in the 1930s when people felt that Vinland was probably in Massachusetts. Now, with the discovery of the Lansall Meadows site, the thinking has shifted to thinking it's in that the they were definitely in northern Newfoundland. And then there's a question of how far south they went. And I'm going to now talk about a possibility of their going much farther south than people have realized, and going all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And a key part of the story here is the gyres, is the movements of the oceans. And you can see here that we have there are gyres above the equator. They run clockwise. Below the equator, they run counterclockwise. And these are the movements of the currents, the predominant movements of the currents in the ocean. And the reason I'm showing you this is that sometimes ships are blown off course and they sink, right? And we don't know anything about them after that. Sometimes they're caught in the gyre, and the gyre takes them far from where they began their journey. And I think the best example of that is there's an example of a Japanese fishing boat in the 1830s that was just sailing near Tokyo, and it got caught. So it was just on a kind of a routine fishing expedition near Tokyo. It got caught in the gyre, and the gyre carried it. It was a sailboat. The mast was broken in a storm, and the ship was carried all the way across the Pacific and landed in Washington State. And there were 3 sailors who survived. Everyone else died of scurvy. And the trip took 130 days. And so that's worth keeping in mind, that such kinds of trips could take place. This was a trip where the mariners wanted to go back to Japan. They had no desire to go anywhere, and they just traveled with their boat that was caught in the gyre. The gyre that we need to think about for thinking about the possibilities of whether the Norse, this is the Lansall Meadows site, how far they could possibly gone down the East Coast. And this blue arrow is a deep underwater current. The red current is the more likely current that a ship would have been blown into. And you'll see it's the Gulf Stream. We all know about that. But the Gulf Stream makes a circle. And when it comes back to North America, it lands on, it goes by the Yucatan Peninsula. So that is something to keep in mind as I show you this next group of slides. And the question I'm asking is, how far south did the Vikings go? And I'm going to propose to you that there's some evidence, it's not conclusive, but there's some suggestive evidence that some Norse made it to the to the Maya city of Chichen Itza, which was the largest city in North America. It had a population probably of around 40,000 people. And it's a city that many people visit today. It's famous for an effect. So when you go to the site and walk in the main gate, this is the first thing you see, this building, the El Castillo. And it's famous because on the equinox on March 21st and September 21st, the sun's shadow forms a dragon. This is the body of a dragon. And then at the bottom of the stairs, this is a staircase. Let me just go back. So this is a staircase. Oh, well, this is a staircase here. And so I'm showing you this side of the staircase, and the sun's shadow forms the body of a dragon. And then here's the head of a dragon. And this is a wonderful thing to see. I haven't seen it. You can look for it on YouTube. It's an important thing because an important phenomenon. It tells us how advanced the Maya were, how much they knew about astronomy, that they were able to build a building this large and capture this very unusual pattern on the equinox. Also at Chichen Itza is the biggest ball court in all of Mesoamerica. And these ball courts are a key indicator of a Mayan site. And they, I was going to say, they're in the Mayan heartland that I showed you, but they go up into the U.S. You can see ball courts in Utah, for example, and in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. But the one in Chichen Itza was the biggest in North America in all of the Mayan territory, and you can see it measured 168 by 70 meters. So this is a major metropolis. And then there's one more monument that I want to talk about because it has some paintings that are very interesting, some murals, some damaged murals. And it's called the Temple of the Warriors. And it was called that because outside of the temple are statues of warriors. And inside the Temple of Warriors were murals. When you visit Chichen Itza now, you cannot go inside any of the buildings. So it's not possible to see the rooms. And the paintings that I'm going to talk about do not exist today. But I'm talking to you about them. What we have, so the original paintings date back to around the year 1000. So this is the perfect time for the Norse presence in North America. And they show some blonde-haired people who are captives here you can see that this person has had his arms bound behind him and thrown into the water. And this was a reproduction done in the 1920s by an American research team from the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C. This is their publication. And you can see that I just showed you this victim, but you can see other victims. This victim has blue beads in his hair. And we know from other Mayan art that a standard way of depicting POWs is to show them with blue beads or beads in their hair. But I show you this to just give you a sense of the scientific quality of this report. And the paintings were done by Anne Axtell Morris. The watercolor copies, the paintings that she was copying were already in fragments. And the report tells you where each fragment was found. They reconstructed this mural here that shows you, it's one of the few paintings that we have that gives us a larger sense of more than just individual details. And you see here another blonde-haired captive with blue beads in his hair, looking as though, he's been thrown in the water, and it looks as though this fish, at least the finished fish, is swimming very close to him in a very menacing way. And here is a boat that has been wrecked. You can see the boat is at an incline going into the water. Now, and this boat here, you can see has a prow, a carved prow. So the question is whether this depicts the Vikings, Norsemen who have come from farther north from Lanzo Meadows or even directly from Scandinavia. And I have to say that many people are not convinced by this evidence, that they think that the blonde hair may be an artistic convention, doesn't necessarily show people who had blonde hair. But there's another piece of evidence that is possibly more convincing. It was certainly more convincing to Mike Coe. He was Yale's a premier Mayanist. He died, unfortunately, last year. But he was very interested in this painting, also from Chichen Itza, from a different building called Las Monjas, which means the nunnery, because the painting showed planks in this boat. And that's very important because all of the Maya canoes were dugout vessels. And the only people in the Americas who made boats with planks were the Chumash, who lived near modern Santa Barbara. So to Mike Coe, this evidence was extremely convincing that this must have been, he felt that this must have been a Viking ship. And I just give you this comparison so you have a mental image of what Mike Coe was thinking about, or what the Mayan artists may have seen. And you can see here that the planks on the outside of the ship are visible. This ship is in a museum, a beautiful museum in Norway, and we know from that it was a burial. But this is a classic shape of a Viking vessel. So the question, I was going to say, to wrap up the Norse, that I was going to say we have hard, incontrovertible archaeological evidence that they landed in Landsaw Meadows. And then it seems likely that they traveled in the region of Newfoundland, probably as far south as Maine. And then there's a possibility that they traveled farther to the Yucatan Peninsula. I think really the only way we're going to be able to confirm this is if, with DNA evidence, we would need DNA evidence from pre-modern, pre-1492 skeletons, local skeletons, to see whether or not there's any Norse DNA in the local population. And there's so far nothing like this has come out. But as you know from reading the newspaper, there's all kinds of discoveries about DNA coming out all the time. And so it's possible that this will go from being an interesting theory to a persuasive theory, or even, and you know, if someone found a bronze pin, like the pin that they found at Landsaw Meadows, that would also be very convincing. I wanted to just mention one thing about, this goes back to the gyres, that there's a Spanish explorer who is in the Yucatan Peninsula and goes to this village where the local people tell him, he asks about the name of the village, and they explain that they explain that 70 Moros, so 70 dark-skinned people, possibly from Africa. That's certainly how Alonso Ponce understood his informants, landed on the Yucatan Peninsula and founded this village. And then they have a conflict with the Mayans, who are controlling the whole region, and they are killed. So that's just to show you that the Yucatan was connected to other places by these ocean gyres. So now I'd like to switch to the second group of people who were sailing or crossing the ocean around the year 1000, and start with these voyages in the Pacific Triangle. And you can see here, this is a map showing you the Pacific Triangle, and this is the latest archaeological evidence of two waves of settlement that is coming from this direction and arriving in Polynesia, in the Central Islands, around sometime between 1025 and 1120, and then sailing in three directions a little bit later. And it looks, I mean, the 3 points of the triangle, so Hawaii and New Zealand and Easter Island, were all settled at around the same time. We have the carbon dates, so we know it's sometime from the end of the 1100s to the end of the 1200s. They were settled at the same time, and we know they were settled at the same time because they have the same artifacts found, the same objects were found in each of these 3 points of the Pacific Triangle. And this is a huge amount of territory. Pacific is enormous, and each leg from the center of the triangle to the corners was about 4,000 kilometers. So this is a massive set of journeys. It's very likely that they set out in all directions, and they did not find things in different directions. But they found the places where they could settle in Easter Island and Hawaii and New Zealand. And it also seems likely that there may have been some kind of disaster that caused them to seek new lands. And of course, you have to think, well, what kind of boats did they have? And with the Polynesians, the Malayo-Polynesians, we don't have archaeological evidence like the boat I just showed you of the Vikings. We have a painting. This is much later evidence. This is from Captain Cook at the end of the 1700s, who shows us the vessels that the local peoples were using at that time. And this is a double canoe. You can see that they have bound two canoes together, and then they've got a sail on the canoe. And the Cook tells us this, that they built a wooden frame between the two canoes that could carry cargo. And one of the things we know about the Polynesian, these voyages in the Pacific, is that they were traveling with animals, because there's evidence of pigs at Easter Island and Hawaii and New Zealand. They were also traveling with women. So these seem to be vessels that when they set off intended to colonize. But we don't know for sure that they were in these kinds of vessels. We just have the archaeological evidence that they arrived at those different islands in the Pacific. And we also know that those islands were not occupied before they arrived. So this is the first settlement of the islands in the Pacific. There's, of course, so we don't know about the boats. We have to reconstruct that. We also don't know how they navigated. But we do know that there was a tradition of navigation among the Polynesians that involved looking at the stars and waves, the movement of waves and fish and birds and animals, and navigating on that basis. And the man in the photograph here, Mau Pialog, was the last person who was traditionally educated in this system of navigation. And here you can see that he's teaching his sons this system of navigation using rocks to represent different stars in the sky. And the way the navigation system worked was that the navigators committed to memory the way that the sky looked in different parts of the Pacific in different seasons. So it doesn't involve any instrumentation, the system of navigation. And actually that's true of the Viking system of navigation too, that the Vikings were navigating, we say with dead reckoning. They were looking at the land forms, and they were in the North Atlantic, so that you could often see when you sailed for a little bit, you left Norway and you got to Iceland, you could see it. And this system of navigation allowed Mao, this we know for sure, to make a huge voyages to places he had never been. And this most famously in 1976, to celebrate the US bicentennial, he traveled on a voyage. He left from Maui and he traveled on a boat that was a reconstructed double canoe, just like the one I showed you, and traveled all the way to Tahiti. And he had never done that voyage before. He did that just on the basis of his knowledge of navigation that he learned from his teachers. Mao was a kind of irascible person, at least you get that I get that impression from reading about him. And there was a journalist, one of the people on the boat, the trip from Hawaii to Tahiti, put a radio transmitter on the boat to follow its course. And Mao was very upset because he wanted to demonstrate that the Polynesian system of navigation would allow people to go all the way from Maui to Polynesia with no navigational instruments. So when he got to Tahiti, he refused to go back to Hawaii. Fortunately, his crew had learned from him about this this system of navigation, and the system of navigation they have since taught to other people. So Mao's system of navigation didn't die. The inset map shows you some of the voyages that Mao took in his where he was from in Micronesia. And there's I think it's just a very funny story that he went on a trip. This is long after the so here's the inset where he is, where he's from, and where he grew up. And in 2003, he goes on a trip, and his family gets concerned because it's 2 weeks after he said he would be back, and he hasn't come back. And so they call the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard catches up with him and says, basically, we can take you home. And he says, I know exactly where I am. I was blown off course. I now know where I am by a storm. And I don't need your help. And so he refuses their help, and then he makes his way home by himself. So this system of navigation was definitely operational for him. Now, whether people historically used the same system of navigation, that we have no way of knowing. The other voyages that the Malayo-Polynesians make are a little bit earlier. They're before the year 1000, probably starting around the year 600. And they sail from the Malay Peninsula to Madagascar. And Madagascar is a very unusual place. It has, people grow rice there and mung beans, and they speak a language, the Malagasy language, that is closer to Malay than it is to any of the languages spoken on the African mainland. And so here you can see the voyages. This is the reconstructed voyages that the Malayo-Polynesians made to Madagascar. And it's a relatively sort of a straight shot across the Indian Ocean. And it is really counterintuitive that the first people to settle in Madagascar came from so far away and not from the African mainland. But that is what the archaeological evidence shows very clearly in terms of diet and what people were eating. And archaeologists have found evidence of a rice diet all on Madagascar. And the only rice that they find being eaten on the East African coast is very predictably in the port cities on the East African coast. So the Malayo-Polynesian voyages are notable for the huge distances that the Malayo-Polynesians crossed, and also for the possible use of this traditional navigation system. Okay, the final part of my talk is about the Chinese voyages that take place. And I have the year 1000 here, and we can talk about this. But we know that the Chinese vessels were taking this route through the Straits of Malacca, and then either hugging the coast or cutting across the Bay of Bengal and going all the way to the Persian Gulf. That this was a historic route. There's a map from the 1300s that gives a travel time from Guangzhou to Oman of 200 days. And so, these voyages, unlike, I was going to say, the Polynesian voyages, and actually even unlike the Viking voyages, that we have lots, because this is China, we have detailed historic records about these voyages. And the voyages this is part of China's trade, which it predates the Song Dynasty. It exists before 960, but it certainly gets going in a major way after 960. And the Chinese are importing from Southeast Asia, all of the goods that are shown on this map. And you can see that many of them are natural goods. Some of them are animal products like tortoise shell or ivory or civet or rhinoceros horn. But many of them are also plants and woods, fragrant woods and spices. Here are cloves. There are also, I was going to say, this is a camphor tree and then this is aloes wood, which has many names in English, I think none of which any American has ever really heard of. Eagle wood and garu wood. It's called chen mu in Chinese, or chen xiang, because it sinks in water. And all of these fragrances and animal products, the blue feathers of the kingfisher bird, these were all things that the Chinese consumed, and they consumed them in very large quantities. We know that this trade was not, I was just saying, I'm talking to quantitative historians, I should be careful, but our indications are that the reason I think that they were consumed in large quantities is that we know that people at the top of the society were consuming them. We know the imperial household is making candles that have lumps of fragrant wood in them. But we also know that people at the bottom of society, that workers are going to fairs where they buy sugarcane that's been steamed in the aloes wood smoke. So there's a huge demand for these goods from Southeast Asia, in China. Some of these goods originally the Chinese were importing from the Arabian Peninsula. And then to pay for the trade was that the Chinese were exporting the ceramics and metal, often in the shape of metal ingots that were used by whoever purchased them to make metal objects. They were also used as ballast in ships, at the bottom of ships, to keep the ships stable. And metal objects were also made like for cauldrons and woks and mirrors. These are all things that are found on that route that I showed you. There are high quality fabrics, cottons and silk, and these have left different archaeological traces behind. The metals sometimes survive. The ceramics almost always survive. And then the high quality fabrics very rarely survive. And the good that people really prized was this blanc de chine vessels. So this is probably from the Dehua kilns in Fujian. These were fired to higher temperatures than ceramics elsewhere in the Indian Ocean. So it was harder, they lasted longer. It was harder for them to break. And we know about Chinese navigation because we have a written account. It's in a book called Pingzhou Ketan by Zhu Yu, and he was the son of a port official. And he tells us that how the boats navigated, that like the Vikings and like the Polynesians, they could make their way following the outline of the coast. They could look at the sun's shadow. They collect samples of mud from the ocean floor to determine their location. This is something that interested me. This slide actually, I think, gives you a hint of the project I think that I'll be working on next, which is about China as an ocean power. And I'm interested, Yale has a map from the actually 19th century that shows, on the map, it shows the color of sand in different places. It's along the Chinese coast. So navigators could collect samples of mud and then look at the color to determine where they were. At night, they could navigate by moonlight. And then Zhu Yu tells us, as a fallback, if these different techniques didn't work, they could use the south pointing needle. And so we know that by the 1100s, and probably a little bit earlier, the Chinese were using the compass to navigate. We have I was going to say, there's a lot of different shipwrecks that have been found really often in the area around Indonesia. The Java Sea is unusually shallow, and I think the average depth is around something like 80 meters. It's very shallow, and it's a place where divers often run into shipwrecks. This shipwreck is a boat that was found in Quangzhou, and we were talking before I began. I was talking to William and Zhu about Quangzhou, and so this is a photograph from the Quangzhou Museum that shows you this boat. And we know that the boat traveled all the way to Southeast Asia because there are some repairs on the boat that were done with wood and string, with dowels, where the traditional Chinese way of building ships was to use wood and nails. And so these repairs were done in a different place where they didn't have nails. And so they used wood and string to make the repairs. And they also used Junam resin, which was used in Thailand and not used in China. So this is an unusual shipwreck that had traveled to the South Seas, and then it came back to China. You can see that it was divided into different compartments. And I was going to say that's evidence of, and that ship, let's just go back for a second. That ship, we have most of the cargo. It sunk very near Quangzhou, and it was excavated in the Cultural Revolution. The archaeologists found some remnants of fragrant woods, exactly what you would predict, aromatics that came from Southeast Asia. So this is a map showing you the different routes that the Chinese could take to Southeast Asia, and then if they continued all the way to the Middle East, how they would travel. We also know that they went all the way south along about halfway down the east coast of Africa, actually to just about Madagascar, and that was a common add-on route. The one thing that's interesting when you look at that map is that the Chinese always go west, and the farthest east they go to the Philippines or they go to Japan. And it's possible that one of the things that prevented them from going further was this idea of the ultimate drain. And this is an idea that goes back, Zhuangzi writes about this, that all the waters in the ocean drain into this, all the waters in the ocean is filled by a source of water, and then the water all drains away in something called the ultimate drain. And it's possible that Chinese mariners thought that the ultimate drain was located somewhere here to the on the east coast, east of Manila, somewhere between south of Taiwan and east of the Philippines. We know that or at least I was going to say, we have textual records describing sailors getting close to the ultimate drain and then turning around and coming back. And so I think that's an interesting question about why the Chinese don't go farther into the Pacific. And the answer may be simple. The answer may be that they don't need to go into the Pacific because everywhere that they're going in Southeast Asia and India and the Middle East is where they can obtain the goods that they can then sell in China. And so that they're doing very well by not traveling into the Pacific. So in the conclusion, I just want to talk about distances. I've been talking a lot about distances just to show you that when we think about Columbus and how far he traveled across the Atlantic, it wasn't that different from what the distances people were covering much earlier. And so I think we talk about the age of discovery starting in 1492 or being in around the 1500s. And the one of the goals of my book about the world in the year 1000 is to show that there was already a lot of ocean travel in this earlier period, and that some of the distances that people covered, I mean, notably the Chinese, were far greater than what Columbus covered, or even what da Gama covered. Now, Magellan's crew, they actually are the first people to circumnavigate the globe. And there's no question that the voyages of the 1500s had immediate and far-reaching effects. There was the deaths of a huge number of the people living in the Americas. And scholars debate the size of the American population, could be somewhere between 10 and 100 million. So whatever you think the population was, you acknowledge that a vast majority of the people living in the Americas died because they had no resistance to the common cold, or smallpox, or the flu. And because they died, then European settlers were able to come into the Americas and bring African slaves with them. And then the creation of the triangle trade turned the Atlantic into a trading center that it had not been historically. But the voyages of the thousands were also important. The Vikings did not have much impact in North America. They were only there for about 10 years, but they had a significant impact on modern day Russia and Ukraine. The Rus, the predecessor state to modern Russia, was founded by a mix of people from Sweden and the local peoples. The Polynesians settled the Pacific and Madagascar. And the Chinese economy was completely intertwined with that of Southeast Asia. And China also was trading with the Islamic world, including East Africa. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie. So this is a good presentation, giving us how many years? About 2,000 years of travel history. And then let me now first invite Professor William Liu of Nanyang University to give a short discussion on the presentation.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, if any of you has a question or wants to make a comment, please write it in the Q&A box, and then I will select some and then read them for Valerie to answer. Go ahead, William.
Okay, thank you, Zhu. Thank you for giving me a chance to join the discussion here. As just mentioned before, Valerie is my teacher, and I know her many years ago. So I can say I'm pretty loyal reader of his books and articles. So today, my comment are more generally organized on her writing style, her research framework, questionnaire, those things, rather than focusing on this specific events, because by and large, I'm an expert on Chinese history, on Song Dynasty. This is really, today, what he talked are really global issues, this with huge, across the huge space and the different people. In my mind, Professor Valerie Hansen is excellent scholarship in qualitative history. Has to do with a global perspective, narrative techniques, and keen to key evidence that's mostly non-quantitative findings from archaeology. So that's my primary comment if I don't have time to finish the whole discussion. So that's my conclusion. Since this event is being hosted by AGI, for the quantitative history series, many of our audience are either economists or historians. We are neighbors, but definitely different groups. I like to talk about this issue, this book, from a methodological perspective. Both economists and historians are doing empirical, well, not all economists are doing empirical research, but some of them are doing empirical research, and their theses are called hypotheses, which favor the term favored by economists, will be testified by evidence. So they have the shared concern. For quantitative historian and economist, this task is simple. Doing empirical research is measure everything measurable and draw the conclusion. And usually that's data and regression model. So when economists talk about globalization, most times they talk about the changes in market integration and look for convergence in living standard. So they look for the data, the real wage, those things, decline in transportation cost, and transaction cost. Well, for historians, the world is really complicated. If you want to develop a comprehensive understanding of the past of our world, you need to study many things non-measurable. So that's the goal for qualitative history. And when they're doing so, as Professor Hansen is doing, they provide narratives supported by non-quantified yet hard evidence. So that's one thing I find in Professor Hansen's writing is he provide a sophisticated yet very sharp qualitative narrative. It's not only just descriptive. You tell your audience an interesting story. It's more than that. You need to be sharp and accurate. Just look at this book title, right? The year 1000, when explorers connected the globe and globalization began. So she chose a specific year for the beginning of globalization, and also, the time, place, main characters. So it's really a hypothesis that needs to be proven by empirical evidence. And I admire her scholarship in a way, this kind of qualitative history rests on the credibility. The narrative has to be logical reasoning, based on logical reasoning. As you can already tell from listening to her talk just minutes ago. She put an emphasis on the change in the natural world, the ocean currency. So that's all related to the science, and also the reasoning. That's a part of the logical reasoning, and the key evidence, right? She emphasized. I mean, if you read his book, she already mentioned in her talk this evidence. How do you find evidence? How do you analyze evidence? And it's same true if you read her books. I mean, it's impressed me is his critical and innovative analysis of evidence. In fact, you have to be keen to watch, to study over again and again what the evidence means. Don't misled by something, just a rough idea, this easy assumption. And you have developed a story. When you have this hard evidence, you have put them together and relate them to complicated historical context. So that always impressed me. A scholar, if you do that way, you have to be knowledgeable. And you have multilingual, right? You use report or secondary studies from scholars in different countries. For example, archaeologists, they usually only provide you on-site report, first-hand information, but they are not responsible for providing a big framework. So that all depends on the historian to use that pieces, effectively and meaningful way. So that's why how I admire scholarship. I probably don't have time. I mean, I have many examples, like in his book, how he analyze the so-called evidence to let the evidence speak out the truth. I will save time. Since I also have 2 questions for Professor Hansen. So let me, I mean, the 2 books the Professor Chen Ziwu just mentioned, I mean, is highly readable. In this way, can tell a reader how do you use evidence to make a narrative. So the qualitative history. One of them is Silk Road, a new history. It's also, cover this long historical period of the communication between China and Eurasia, Central Asian countries, and these different cultures, different civilization. It's very readable, well organized. I have the 2 questions for Professor Hansen. The question 1 is, before the European hegemony, you must read the book, The World System by Janet Abelahu. And you also mentioned in your talk, you are going to start a new book project which focuses on the rise of China's naval force during the Tang Song transformation. And you already discussed a little bit on the voyage by Chinese in South China Sea and this Indian Ocean. How do you view your study of the globalization of this voyage, the exchange of commodity, culture, religion? How do you frame your story? What's any difference between your study and Abelahu? He mentions the so-called world system, the globalization. She views the globalization as a world system. And she also quotes Hardwell research. And she mentions, I remember, in the last chapter of her book, the economy of the Southern Song dynasty served as a powerhouse of the world system in the 13th century. Do you agree or disagree with her? So please let us know your ideas about how you write your new book. And another question is, I find your recent writing very inspiring because they focus on long-term, comparative, and global perspective. Why you choose such macro perspective instead of choosing, say, local history perspective? Just focus on one dynasty, one place, one elite family, and it's an unpopular choice, right? When one chooses a global perspective, it seems difficult. You have paid much effort, time, energy. You have studied foreign language, international traveling, visiting the archaeological sites. Why you do so? I also, suggest in your previous talk, this probably Hardwell's legacy, the founding father of Song Dynasty research in the United States, and he's your PhD advisor. Can you tell me something more about your professional choice? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I answer those
questions? Valerie said, please, go ahead. Make it short. Yeah.
Okay.
There are many questions in the Q&A box. Yes.
The question about Janet Abu-Lughod, and she was writing, I just checked, in 1989. So she was writing a while ago. Her book is about the period from 1250 to 1350. And she's emphasizing really the connections that occur because of the Mongol unification, the Mongol Empire, and its impact on the area around it. And I would say the big difference between her book and my book is time, that I'm looking at the earlier period. And I'm also looking at the whole world, that I have a fair amount to say about America and the Americas. And that's something she didn't talk about. The second question was a very generous question, but I think that there's a huge payoff for doing global history because people are interested in the whole world, right? So maybe historians focus on local studies because it's what we are trained to do. It's easy to focus when you have a strong group of sources from one place. And I, like many people, wrote about that, a single place in my dissertation, or a couple of different places in my dissertation. But I think the real payoff of global history is being able to have meaningful comparisons about different places. And I would say you're absolutely right that this goes back to Hartwell, to my PhD advisor, that he was very interested in industrial production of iron and steel in China, and comparing it to England and noting that it was much higher. The British reached the Chinese level of production around 1700. And I mean, Professor Leo is very modest, but he's also written about this in a very interesting way. So I think that's good for my answers.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Valerie. Actually, before I read questions for you from the audience, I have one question. As you also referred, mentioned at the beginning, you know, your presentation is based on mostly objects, goods, and techniques that may have been adopted, inherited by the Mayans and Polynesians and others, including the goods from the Arabic Peninsula and different Southeast Asian countries to China and likewise. But then that still does not address a bigger question, that is, who were the players? Who were the ones who were moving the goods from China to the Arabic Peninsula, to Persia, and then to the coastal places along the Indian Ocean and so on? I mean, because someone, Yu Chen Lin also asked a related question in the Q&A box, that is there any DNA evidence some of the Chinese who sailed to Southeast Asia in the early periods have settled locally? So that's one of the things that I've personally been spending a lot of time on, because we know, you know, even today, there are people around Guangzhou and then also around Quanzhou who clearly are descendants, at least to some degree, of Arabic settlers, Arabic traders from the 7th century, 8th century, and the 9th century, let alone the more recent traders who settled in China, had their families, and then they never returned to the Arabic world or to Southeast Asia. But until the 10th century, there was no evidence or no mention by anyone, travelers or otherwise, of Chinese who actually settled in Indonesia or today's Malaysia, let alone even today. We cannot find any Chinatown anywhere on the Arabic Peninsula or in India, for that matter, that would go back to, in terms of the founding time of those Chinatowns, going back to the 9th century, 10th century. So what I'm trying to say is that probably it's the foreigners who were actually bringing Chinese goods to their hometowns. It's also the Arabic traders, for the most part, who were bringing things, all the wonderful things that the Chinese elite were really enjoying during the Sui dynasty, especially Sui Wendi, Sui Yangdi. He was particularly fond of all the aromatic goods from Persia and anyway in the Indian Ocean. So the Arabic traders were the ones who did all the laborious work on the ocean and then transported everything to Guangzhou and Quanzhou. And then the local Chinese traders would take everything onward from that point on. But in terms of the goods from China to the other countries, it's again the Arabic traders. I'm just saying that it's great to know when goods exchanges started to occur, at least going back to the year 1000. So we could see evidence of things that came from different parts of the world and then somehow converged in the Mayan land and in Newfoundland and other places. But that still does not, because growing up in China, I usually read books that would say, so as long as we can find certain Chinese goods that went to North America, then wow, our ancestors went there. No, that's a different conclusion to draw, right? Finding things in North America that were there many, many centuries ago does not mean it's the Chinese who actually went that far and tried to sell those goods or do whatever there. Anyway, how would you respond to maybe the DNA evidence is one of the ways, because now, especially there are archaeologists who really focus on ancient DNA traces as a way to see how the population movement was taking place.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, I agree with you completely that you can use archaeological evidence to demonstrate that there was the existence of a trade, but identifying the key players is a different problem. Most of the people who work in this field, and I saw a question from Andrew Chittick, see the year 1000 or sometime around the year 1000 as a turning point. And before 1000, just what you were saying, they see the Arab traders as playing the key role. Going forward and then shifting in the year 1000, and that may have to do with the Guangzhou Rebellion and the massacre of the Arab merchants who were living in China. It may have to do with technology like the compass and a lot of other attributes of Chinese ships that suddenly make Chinese ships more reliable more dependable than dhows or the last lug ships that were in use before 1000. I'm optimistic going forward that we will figure this out, or we'll get a better handle on it. I don't know of any DNA evidence from Southeast Asia, but I think it's coming, right? This kind of analysis is just starting to get going now. And we also have inscriptional evidence. So we have early inscriptions. There are inscriptions in Chinese. There were some Chinese inscriptions in India from like the 1200s. So and there was a Chinese pagoda. I forget which Indian settlement. It might have been in Nagapattinam. There's a book about that. I think the next step is going to be figuring out the nature of the trade. Some of the people in the questions ask about the tribute trade. And one of the things that we've learned about the Sung is that there is according to our records, which we're learning every day are not as reliable as we used to think they were, the tribute trade seems to die off. The government is not spending that much energy on the tribute trade after about 1030, and instead it's focusing on taxing the trade. And I think most of the voyages are not sponsored by the government. I think they're sponsored by private traders. The government is reaping the benefits by taxing those voyages. And the big exception, of course, is the Zhenghe voyages that we all know about in the Ming, which definitely are sponsored by the government. So, I think, Zhiwu, you ask a very good question that will keep many of us occupied for a while.
Okay, that's good. So let me pick a few questions for you. Okay, the first one is from Shmuel Yerushalmi. I want to know if we have any evidence of establishment of settlements and colonies by the Vikings in America and other overseas places they arrived at. And what can you say about the economic and social regime of the Vikings?
So yes, we have the evidence from Lancelot Meadows, but we have evidence of settlements in Greenland. There were 2 Viking settlements in Greenland. We have the settlement of Iceland. In terms of the economic and social regime, this is basically a war-band society. So in the Greenland settlements, I mean, I think at their peak, there might have been about 3,000 people in them. And it's basically a farming society, and with the different political units being groups of people led by a headman or a war band leader. And that's, I don't think there's any debate about that. That's well established.
Okay, the next question or comment from David Mish. Your discussion of Polynesian travel reminded me of reading Thor Heyerdahl and Kon-Tiki in my youth. As I recall, he did some biosum raft trip in the South Seas in the 1940s. Is this of any relevance to your narrative?
It is. I was going to say there's a question about whether the Polynesians traveled beyond Easter Island to Latin America, to South America, or whether people in South America traveled to Polynesia. That's what Thor Heyerdahl thought. He thought the direction of travel was from Ecuador or from Ecuador going west. I think most people think that Kon-Tiki reached the wrong conclusions, that the ocean currents are important here. I was going to say it's complicated. There's a lot to read. The main thing is there's some new DNA evidence which seems to show that some of the people living in the islands of Polynesia, particularly the Marquesa Islands, had DNA that was from South America, but they had no DNA from Europeans. So it suggests that there was earlier contact with South America than with the Europeans. That said, I would say I will personally be more convinced when we have DNA from historic skeletons and not from modern populations, because the modern populations move around so much. It's very hard to know the ancestry of somebody living in 1950 and whether there's such a great likelihood of their ancestry involving movement of people around different continents. So I think that's an ongoing question about whether or not there were ocean voyages before 1492 between South America and Easter Island or the other Polynesian islands.
Okay, thank you. The next question, actually, 2 questions from Peter Solo. Are the Viking and Malay cases different from the Chinese case in that the first 2 involved settlement with very little trade, while the last, that is the Chinese case, may have involved mainly trade, but no settlement? So this is very related to what I was saying earlier. So the 2 questions are, first, was Chinese settlement in Southeast Asia and beyond significant in this period? That's the first question. The second question, does this suggest that Chinese navigational techniques were more reliable in that we don't know much about Viking and Malay voyages that didn't arrive, or perhaps the Chinese mainly followed the coasts?
These are a very good set of questions. The first thing is my impression, but I don't know that much about this, is that the Chinese settlement in Southeast Asia is a little bit later. It's probably starting in like the 1300s. So in this early period, I don't think there's very many Chinese living in Southeast Asia. And then, does it mean that the Chinese navigational techniques were more reliable? I mean, they have the compass, but we don't know much about Viking and Malay voyages that didn't arrive. We don't know much about Chinese voyages that didn't arrive. And I think one of the things lines of inquiry that's very promising, and actually, Jiwoo, goes back to your question, is about shipwrecks. That so far we've been looking at the objects in the shipwrecks and trying to figure out where the ships were going when they sank. But now I was just reading a very interesting article by Derek Hung about the Bailey Tung wreck, and he reconstructs the voyage. And this is from the 826 or 827. And he thinks that, just what you were saying, Jiwoo, that it's the Arabs that are, it's a dhow, so it's not a Chinese style ship. It's maybe it's an Indian Ocean or a Persian Gulf type boat. It's going to Chinese ports and picking up goods that have been Chinese ceramics that have been manufactured for an export audience. And so I think the shipwrecks may be a place we're going to get some of this information. But I think Peter Solar's point about the nature of the trade being different, or the nature of these voyages being different, is a very fair point, that the Viking and Malay cases are really about settlement of colonies as opposed to ongoing trade, which is what the Chinese voyages are about.
So Valerie, actually, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the religious motivation behind the European explorations, whereas for the Chinese, no such drive to drive them far away, to go far away and then settle there. Okay, the next question is from Kylie. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm interested in why the early voyages around the year 1000 had not left a devastating impact as that in the 1500s, that is a death of 20 million American Indians. I mean, this is also related to what we were saying earlier. Go ahead, Valerie.
Right, and I also think it's a very timely question now, right? Thinking about COVID, in the shadow of COVID-19, that this is a question I've thought a lot about and talked to people about, and I think that when the Vikings touched down in North America, they just may not have had very sustained contact with the local peoples. They leave after about 10 years, and the great die out of the Americas starts about 30 years after Columbus arrives, after 1492. So that's one possibility, that there was less contact between, there are a couple of possibilities, less contact between the Vikings who arrived and the local peoples. Another possibility is there were die-outs and we don't know about them. That's because our historic record is far from perfect, and the Icelandic sagas would not really have discussed any kind of deaths among the local peoples. And then another possibility is that the picture of disease in the year 1000 was different than the picture of disease in the 1500s, or the kinds of diseases Europeans had were different. So my answer, but I'm not an epidemiologist. My answer is that there wasn't enough sustained contact between the Norse and the people living in the Americas.
Thank you. So the next question is from Alexander Schumann. Could you elaborate on the social and economic background of these voyages? For example, were the seafarers mostly men? Were they daredevils who had nothing to lose? Or was such a journey linked to high status, prestige? How were the journeys funded? Yeah.
This is a very poetic question. I think this goes back to the question of who was involved. Yes, I think we can say with confidence that it's mostly men. Were they daredevils who had nothing to lose? Well, I was going to say, when we look at the shipwrecks, and we have about maybe 10, maybe 20 shipwrecks where we have a fair amount of information from them. And this is just something I've started to think about. We can see some ships where they have a load that seems that it has a single owner. Like there are 50,000 ceramics that look identical. And this is true of the Beilitung, that ship I was talking about from 826. There are other ships that have a variety of goods on them. And so people think it's possible that the single owner ones may have been tribute vessels. The multiple goods may have been funded by merchants. I think everybody has something to lose. These are ships loaded with cargo. And so I think the profit motive, in the absence of other evidence, I would look at this as merchants who are hoping to make money with these voyages. I don't think there's anybody who has nothing to lose. Everybody has something to lose. Oh, funding. I think a mix of government funding and also merchant funding. The Quanzhou ship, where we actually have some information, we have labels that survived that were on the goods that sank. We know the Sung imperial family was investing in the ship. So I would say it's hard. You can't draw a sharp line between the government and merchants because the government is involved in trade, right? So there are officials who are trading, and then there are also merchants who are financing those voyages.
Yeah, so the next question is related to this from Pei Xiaoshan. Thank you for your lecture. What are the reasons behind the Chinese voyages? What I know is that the Chinese voyages are mostly based on the tributary system. So what are they? How much of the drive for those voyages was due to economic factors, and how much due to tributary factors?
Yeah, I gave a brief answer to this, and we're almost out of time. I would say that one of the things that's striking about the Sung dynasty is that, they don't abolish the tributary system, but they pay less attention to it. And this is after 1030, and they're really focusing on taxing the trade and not on sending these delegations to distant places. And it's one of the striking characteristics of the Sung dynasty.
Okay, let me pick two more questions, if that's okay, Valerie? There are many more, but we are running out of time. The next one is from Andrew Chiddick. Southeast Asian ships had been sailing.
So, Drew, I'm gonna cut you off because I kind of answered that.
Oh, okay. So that's good. Okay. Let me pick a shorter one then. This is from Chen Huangrui. Thank you very much for your fantastic lecture. I wonder why you chose these three cases, and what was the motivation of ocean travel for your next project?
Oh, well, I was going to say I chose the three cases I talked about today because they're the examples that we have the most information about of people moving the farthest in the year 1000. So they illustrate my argument that what's going on in the year 1000, no one is like Magellan's crew. I say Magellan's crew because Magellan was killed in circumnavigating the globe, but people are traveling huge distances around the globe. And I wanted very early on, and I wanted to talk about that today. That was the motivating force behind the talk.
Okay, so we're out of time. So Valerie will send you the remaining questions, and then you can think about how to address them afterwards. Thank you very much. I know this is a very, very early talk, starting at 7:30 a.m. in New Haven time. Yeah, it's a very kind thing for you to offer us so early in the morning. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me. As I told you in our first emails about this talk, I would much rather be the person talking in the morning than the person talking at night. So I thank all of you for keeping your eyes open at this point in the day or in the evening for you. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. And thank you, William, for your very good questions.
Yeah, thank you, William, for the wonderful discussion. And also my thanks go to all the attendees who are still with us. I see that there are more than 180 still not leaving yet. So thank you very much from the University of Hong Kong. Okay, so for our next two webinars, we have Professor Li Nan from Fudan University. He will speak on March 4th, that is a week from today, followed by a talk by Eric Cheney, who is an associate professor of economic history at the University of Oxford. So please stay tuned, and if you have not registered with us for the email list and so on, please do so. So hope to see you in the coming 2 weeks. Thank you.